please. Hail, hail, the Celts are here, and what the hell do we care anyway? The international dead zone is all but over, and in an effort to bring us back into, the Celtic playing and chasing down an historic ninth treble here on the channel, we've got a special guest joining us on the show. We've got the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, and everything else in between. He is known to shag a few spreadsheets as well. It's Juco James. Juco, good to see you.
Good to see you, Quinny. Thank you for inviting me.
Long overdue, buddy. You were gracious enough, you and Alan, to have me over at your place. The last international break, in fact,
I think it was, yeah.
Feels like an eternity ago, but yeah, the last international break I was over at your place, and we had a real time.
In game time, it was an infinity ago. I think Celtic have played 5,000 games since then, but so it just seems like a lot longer than it probably was.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, you're quite right there. It's been the ultra marathon, as Brendan called it, and that's a kind of a piece of verbiage that I've hung on to the whole way through, because it has been like relentless every 2 or 3 days. Quite a consistent squad for the most part. We've had the moments where we've felt we've got lots of depth and we're actually quite well built, and then fast forward a week or 2 later, and everyone feels quite the opposite. And I was saying to you before we came on, James, but I kind of titled the show "Celtic's Progress," mind the gap and all that stuff, because this year the buzzword, the theme has been progression, and that's came in a lot of different forms of conversation, whether it be Champions League, transfers, player development, the manager, the gap. There's lots of stuff that's kind of going around here. There's a few things we are going to touch on. Fist bumps to everyone on arrival that's joining us live and loud. If anyone who's not joining us live, please be sure to hit the like button as well, of course, and leave your comments down below on anything that's going on in the chat. But James, for yourself, when I throw the word out there, Celtic progression in the year 24-25, what's the first thing that jumps to mind for you in terms of the categorization of that?
Yeah.
Main thing that you feel is apparent?
I would say fairly narrow, actually. Kind of the analytical framework that I have in looking at kind of broad performance club all the way down to trying to delineate between recruitment and managerial decisions, coaching, and then stuff that players can control and what they can't control. And I try to break all this out and do my spreadsheet shagging that way. I actually don't think we've progressed that much in things that we can control. I think a lot of things that we don't control went our way this season so far. Partly, domestically, Rangers have been a basket case. A lot of what went on there we can't control, obviously, by definition. Champions League, we got one of the easier draws in the competition. And then a couple of the key games, we got, I would say, fortunate results. Again, things that we couldn't control. We couldn't control Atalanta's finishing that day when their barrage of chances that they, we kind of saw a similar situation this past week in international football with Scotland at Greece, right? I don't know if you looked at the statistics for that game. Greece, I watched a little bit of the game and it was like, Jesus, like Greece is barraging Scotland here. And then Scotland pulled out, and I looked at the stats after the game on FOTMob, and they had like almost no post shot XG. So they had, I think, one shot on target, and it was like a scuffed, crap shot. So, Scotland couldn't control that. And then you saw what happened yesterday when some of the finishing came back, and it was just the onslaught continued. So the result and the performance weren't all that different. I should say the performance wasn't all that different in Greece versus at Hampden, yet the results were so much different. So I actually don't think we've made a lot of progress on kind of the underlying fundamentals of things that we can control. Outside of one thing, and Alan and I have talked about this on Huddle Breakdown, which is hopefully the material decline in injuries, particularly soft tissue injuries, which we've talked about the last few seasons. Rodgers has had a really kind of checkered past with that. And in some degree, it's, coaches that play styles that are very counter press intensive, very pressing intensive. Like that's a recipe for pulling hamstrings and quads and calves. You've seen that with Ange at Tottenham. We saw it with Ange at Celtic. You saw it with Bielsa leads. I mean, it's just that's
Klopp.
kind of Klopp. Yeah, it's a byproduct of playing that style, and particularly if your depth gets constrained, like we saw in Ange's first season, where we flogged Turnbull and Rogic to death for 4 months before the winter, the January window. So I think that is probably the biggest thing that we can control that we've seen. Hopefully we're controlling that. I mean, hopefully that's not luck. Like as an outsider, we can't know, but
Yep.
materially improved on, and we've not had a hugely big depth in the squad, particularly in this second part of the season. So yeah, I actually think that because if you go look back to the Champions League last season, we had kind of an easy draw too. It wasn't the worst draw, but we were flogged with injuries. I mean, we're basically had no center backs, and then Hatate was out, and so none of those things really happened this season. So I think it was a combination of that and some little bit of fortune. Bruges, for whatever reason, deciding to try to just batten down the hatches after going up 1-0 instead of continuing to hammer us, that kind of stuff. So not something we could control, but fortunately they did it. So yeah, I'd say that's probably I'm outside consensus on that. Most significant, I would say by some distance, I think most people think there's been material progress, and I think we're kind of consistent with the underlying fundamentals. With that injury component is probably the biggest.
That's not something I've certainly heard you and Alan mention it, of course, but again, when I'm thinking about the overall progression of the season, the management of the season, that's not something that always is something that I'm cognizant of or I'm thinking about or whatever. But although like Bernardo's been out for like a month or two, Forrest about the same, those are really like the only injuries that have kind of reared their head. And like I mentioned, kind of in the tip off, like when they were fit, it felt like, wow, squad's two to a man everywhere. We've got good options. We can make subs at any time. And normally, like as you say, last year, our injuries have been to like primary players or to the best 11 guys, which is kind of how we ended up with Naroki and Lagerbielke, because we got injuries like last minute. It was just like anyone who's a centre back, bring them in, kind of thing. Hatate, etc. Even Kyogo in previous spells.
What was his name on loan from Liverpool? What was this guy? I forget. It's slipping him.
Nat Phillips.
Nat Phillips. Yeah, I was going to say my decrepit brain. Remember that guy?
Yeah. There's always got to be one in a generation, isn't there, that comes in for that spot. Nat Phillips
emergency last second loan that barely played. Yeah. So it's been so I will say, like I think there was that kind of squeaky bum time after the Dortmund result where again, Al and I talked about at the time, we were hoping that it was mostly Rodgers' ego lashing out in the week after that, and was talking about, I'm not changing how I play and all this other crap, and it was like, oh my God, he's directly contradicting what he said when he returned to the club and saying, we need to be more realistic in how we play in Europe. And then that happened, and it's like, oh God, is he on tilt now? And to his credit, he wasn't. I think he was blowing off some steam, which again, fair enough. But I do think we made progress post Ange. Like, it just wasn't season over season. Like, I actually thought our fundamentals, if you net out the player injury issues last Champions League, like when we played 11v11, like between guys being injured and red cards, those were the two big issues.
Yeah.
It was Holm and I forget who the other one was.
Maeda.
Maeda. That's right.
Any red card question, the answer is Maeda.
Yeah, fair enough. You're right. But yeah, I thought actually when we were 11v11, even with the injuries, like our structure, the way we were playing was actually, we went into that Feyenoord game very bare bones, kind of shockingly so. I was like, oh crap. And I thought we did really, really well. So I thought, that part, I thought was consistently improved year over year. It's just not that's not unique to this season. I think that was structural, to Rodgers' credit, upon his return. So that was very important, very material, relative to giving us more of a shot in Europe. Because I never thought Ange's style of play was ever gonna scale to Champions League or even like higher levels of Europa League, unless our player recruitment model just made leaps and bounds. Unless we got bought by Tony Bloom or something like that. Radical. I just didn't see that style of play scaling.
Yeah, because the style of play in Europe has been one of the main progression yardsticks that we've all kind of leaned against the club throughout, various managers, various generations of squad. And this year, like, yeah, the fixture list was kinder to us, but it has been somewhat kind to us in the past, which I think we can all acknowledge. We are still sensitive, I think. Like I said this maybe last season. I think it was last season or maybe the one before. But the way Celtic are at the moment, like, we in the previous model of the Champions League, certainly less so now, I think, although not completely immune from it. But in the last system, you could spend 100 million in a transfer window, and if the group stage draw goes against you, it will not matter. Like, it's just
You're
just the way
right.
it was built, and the way the opposition goes. So there's like, how much do you spend to become Champions League level? It's kind of like it's an unanswerable question in some ways. But I think in the current structure, like, although, like, with all the statistics and all the kind of analysis stuff that comes out, it does rank us in like the top, maybe the top one, but certainly the top three, like, fixture strength thing that we got this year, in terms of the teams that we got for the pots and whatever. And it's very hard to imagine it will always be that sweet year on year, of course, because it's just pure RNG. But I think there's certainly been it's maybe one of these intangibles, but I really did feel this year, like the Atalanta thing, of course, there is a wee bit of favourable force majeure that goes in your favour when the highest scoring team in Europe for the last however long just can't, find the back of the net all of a sudden. But it did feel like some of the stuff, like you say, Rodgers did seem to adapt in some games. And some of the players now, like Hatate, this was his 4th Champions League campaign. Same with Maeda. Alistair Johnson's like 3rd. Vickers barely plays Champions League, but it's like his 4th campaign or something. And one or two others. And it did feel like one of the things that is like, as a fan of European football, when I'm watching the teams that everyone throws against Celtic, like Bruges, Benfica, Feyenoord, this one, that one. When you watch some of these teams in Europe get results and you go, why don't Celtic do that? It's because some of them are maybe a bit more battle hardened, or, they've got something else that we don't. But this year I felt like we are actually one of those teams this year where it's like, we're back to being that spot of, might not necessarily be that we've got a Larson again, or we've got some sort of maverick talent, or it maybe falls a wee bit more on the manager. But I felt like we had that little bit of an intangible where we came into the competition this year and the results made the team, like, they grew through the game. There was that kind of progression through it. But there is that, one of the things we were saying coming into it is there wasn't maybe a material difference, like you say, for some of the things, but it does kind of highlight the steps that were made maybe from the Ange era into this era, and we're now seeing where maybe the next steps could be from there. And I think a lot of Celtic fans, and this is where I'll throw it back to you on, a lot of people see that next step as being some sort of solution of the Rubik's Cube that is our midfield, with, the profile types, who's playing where, who's going to be here, who's not going to be here, that kind of stuff, how do you feel on, like, the that kind of stuff, as we find it at this point in the season?
Yeah, so that remains my kind of legacy concern as far as going to that next step is recruitment period. And I just don't think we operate in a modern way in that regard. I think we have a major shareholder who has undue influence. I'd like to see the support transpose or replace board criticism with Mr. Desmond criticism, because he is effectively the board. So, I think the degree with which he intercedes in football operations would probably surprise most people. So I think that's a material problem. I don't see much in the way of that changing, and I think we've benefited from, again, uncontrollable aspects or things that are going to be difficult to replicate. So, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, I think one of the most material aspects of our success in the last, kind of the Ange period and then into Brendan 2.0 here has been the recruitment out of Japan. I mean, there's basically, 3 players there that have been material needle movers in what they've brought to the club. And we're not repeating that, right? That was an aberration based off of Ange coming from Japan and him and his agent knowing some guys and bringing them in. And that Japan being a relatively undermined, mining for talent, underpriced market, and that is now adjusting. It's getting more expensive. So I don't think we're going to replicate that. I don't think we're going to replicate having a guy like McCree say no and us accidentally getting into Matt O'Reilly, or the Saudis going completely insane again and giving us another 25 million for a guy who's nowhere near. I love Jota and he's a good player, but he was never worth that in the free market. Like, it was like a crazy overpay. So I just, there's a lot of these kind of things. I'm like, okay, well, how? Because I think we're kind of at a dangerous point relative to the squad, midfield included. Like, we have a lot of guys. If we're going to be a selling club, if we're going to be a player trading club, we have a lot of guys who we should be moving on, right? Carter Vickers, Johnston, Maeda, Hatate, 4 huge players, all should leave this summer. When I say should, I'm not saying I want them to. I'm saying that they've been at the club long enough that if you're a player trading club, 3 to 4 seasons is kind of long, especially if they're good players. And if they could move on to double or triple their wages, if you hinder those players from moving on, then all of a sudden you're breaking that, kind of posture in the marketplace. If you're a destination club for player trading, if you're a guy, who's looking at clubs where I could go and I'm going to get access to the riches in the English Premier League or some Big 5 league, it's a two-way street. Like, the club's got to, you have to be a portal of talent development and opening up that opportunity. And we saw that with what happened in a 10 in a row season when we forced guys not to leave and that didn't turn out real well. So you start playing with fire. And so, I think with the turnover of 2, 3, or even 4 core players this summer, you got to replace them then. And then again, that falls back on recruitment. And so, realistically, I think Hatate should be gone this summer. Like, he's reported to be wanting to leave 2 years in a row now. So for us to keep him for our 3rd season, I think would be kind of be nuts. So I think minimally we'll have to replace him. And I think, to your point, back to this issue of competing more in Europe, it's about, when you look at some of these other teams like Feyenoord, et cetera, Bruges, it's about athleticism, raw athleticism. And that's where I think generally we've lacked in midfield. So whether that's, persistent pace, size, strength, kind of, you think about these box to box guys that can just run for days and, not get muscled off the ball real easily. I think we're still, the guy we signed for pace and power isn't all that fast and isn't all that powerful in Engels. I mean, he's decent, but not at the European level, right? I mean, that's, again, you got to, in Scotland, he looks okay, but you start looking at him versus some of these, like, they're not as good of footballers as we have it. You look at young boys. I mean, it's like it's like you're watching an NBA team in certain ways, like, shooting guards and point guards, like 6'2", 6'3", like ripped guys. That can really run. So I think that's, from a midfield perspective, I think we need to do a better job when we do replace whoever's going to leave, probably Hatate prominently in midfield. That would be, and I've been talking about this for like 3 seasons now, that we need that, like that high end box to box, and the most, I would argue the closest that we've had to that, and he's not necessarily powerful, but I thought he fit that athletically, was Christie, and we never played him there. We always played him as a 10 or as a wing. Hello, Scotland. Don't play him at wing. Look at what he's done at Bournemouth. So.
Yeah. And in terms of the Japan thing, I'm quite with you there. I started a little kind of mini series on the channel last week. I started it in Scotland in terms of just looking at some players that, maybe stood out, maybe somewhere in the squad there could be a place for them depending on who we're chatting about. And one of the biggest requests off the back of that was to look at the J League, and I'll have another little gander back there, of course. But one thing about when Ange came in and the Japanese imports that have made such a big impact, there is there is a big chunk of fortune in that as well, because like that crop was like a generational kind of thing coming out of Japan. It wasn't just the 3 guys we got, but there was about 7 or 8 guys that went across Belgium and France in particular. Some of them have found their way into England and whatnot. And that's not just like, they're Japan's. It's true, I'm not disputing anything, of course, but it's not just that like Japan was overlooked or undermined. It's also just that they had a little golden crop also creep out in that
Yep.
kind of period. So I hope that the number one thing I hope, so a lot of people are harping for Celtic to go back to Japan. And maybe there is some players in Japan we should still look at, don't get me wrong. But I hope the number one lesson that they've taken from that isn't necessarily to go shopping in Japan, but it's if you get a sniff of it's actually like 8 guys over there, maybe just actually buy 6 of them this time rather than 3. Or make sure, if we did actually get some guys from the K League, we also got Iwata as well. Maybe make sure you just push the boat out and get the top 6 rather than the middle 5 or whatever, or however you want to think of it, because there's a few guys we missed out on that could have been extra sweet. And I do hope, like, I make you quite right, and I'm definitely on the same page of like the player trading model, buy the playbook on paper. Like Hatate's time is to be sold as should be now. One of the things I always struggle with this conversation, but is if I was another club, I wouldn't be that convinced to sign in Hatate from what I've seen of him at Celtic, like so it's a really tough one because it's kind of like Kyogo. I think Kyogo was kind of like that as well, where some clubs are like, yeah, we'd maybe like him, but we're not like he's our top target. We need to go and get this guy. They're not quite there, are they? They're still missing a piece.
Yeah, I've one of the criticisms I've had with the club is that when we've sold has not been all of that smart. So it's a delicate balance between current priority, the pending season, and then having that kind of player trading model parallel. I mean, does everyone remember the 14 million bid for Encham that was reported for Porto, and then he goes away for nothing? You had that again, that 10 in a row season where we had those cluster of players where I would argue we badly under monetized the collection of Ayer, Edouard, and Christie. Particularly Ayer and Christie are like locked down English Premier League level starters now. I mean, we're not talking top, 6 teams necessarily as far as budget, that type of thing, but there's really solid players producing for good teams in the English Premier League. And I mean, between the two of them, would we get 20 million, something like that?
So I can't remember what we got for Christie, but Ayer was all right.
Ayer was like 13, 14, I think. And yeah, I thought Christie was like maybe 5. But again, we ran down the contracts. All reports of players wanted to leave that summer, and then they didn't. And so, there's been we got what, 12 million for Frimpong. That's crazy. I mean,
it was brilliant. That's a great deal.
Right. Well, and then we get to sell on, and we'll make more, hopefully, if he moves this summer, as it sounds like he might. But so I don't think when we've sold has been great. So it comes down to not only player recruitment, it's squad management, and how do you build this architecture of rotating players through with, these. This is why advanced sporting operations now have huge departments in operations, analyzing this crap, because it's not easy. It's not simple. Totally. Doing all these different things between, career path from the academy up through and getting playing time and having that pathway, and then the recruitment. You can't leave your team barren of leadership, and I get a bad name on some of the qualitatives, which I think are important. I just don't think they're nearly as important as kind of common narratives and performance attribution lend them to be. So you need to have like a diverse group of professionals in your squad, and not only because of European rules and that kind of stuff, but culture. And the markets are dynamic. These things are always changing. So look at what's going on with Salzburg and how they were first movers into Africa, and now everyone and their twin cousin is in Africa. So now they lost their moat. They call, in business, they call that a moat. If you got a broad moat, you can screw your customers by charging them more. And in business, that's a good thing. Well, when you don't have a moat, competitors come in and squash your margins. And that's basically what's happened to Salzburg. So now they're trying to move to Eastern Europe more, and, some of these other things. So these things are dynamic. So what you need to do is have smart people empowered with, quality data and robust analytical frameworks to be able to navigate and layer these things structurally over time. It's not just, this transfer window. You should be planning out next transfer window, next season, the season after that. I mean, you really should be in a 3 to 5 year life cycle, squad planning process. and talent acquisition and trading process. And I don't think we're doing any of that. I've been able to see evidence of really any of that happening. I think it's like hair on fire. And in fairness, that's the vast majority of the industry, right? I mean, that's why, that's how a lot of other sports had been historically until the analytics revolution, starting 25 years ago. So, but that's the clubs that are punching above their weight. That's what they're doing. I mean, that's how Brighton's doing what they're doing. That's how Azad Alkmaar's doing what they're doing. They're all doing it in different ways. You can't just take one model and transport it over because everyone's got their own unique operating environment. Celtic have Brexit and all these other things that Bodo Glimt doesn't have, and et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of squad planning has to be taking place, or else you end up, selling your star striker and then panicking in the last day of the window and not being able to replace them. And, it's like, how does this happen? It keeps happening over and over, this kind of stuff. As Celtic supporters, you just pull your hair out. It's because that kind of operations part of the club isn't being run properly.
There's definitely a big expectation that we see progression from that side of things with the transfer doctor, the football doctor. What was his name again? The man that we've hired.
Tisdale, yeah.
Tisdale, of course, yeah. So, again, there was some excuses made for that department in January, like, oh, maybe that's them just in, maybe it was too soon for them. It's just kind of like a wee bit, okay. But huge expectations will certainly be on them in the summer, because like you say, like, if this is the realm we're going to live in, if this is the life we're going to live of player development, it's kind of two things we've kind of touched on here in terms of, like, obviously by jettisoning like a couple of players because their time is up, and selling them into the market. The flip side of that is you should be like hoovering up maybe 7 or 8, because then you've got, like, in any player trading model, and it's not just necessarily Celtic in the kind of 2-bit biscuit tin mentality that we've kind of had, where you sell one guy for a big sum and go get 5 guys for £2. That, but kind of like not penny pinching unreasonable. If you scale that up a little bit, it's just kind of how the way it should work. And at the moment, like, we've done all right off of the back of Bernabei. I think we're going to make some money off of Lagerbielke as well, for what it's worth. And there's maybe a few other guys where that's kind of going on. And Celtic should be enjoying those transfer fees coming in, because we've not had that kind of situation for a long while, where our excess, our, like, guys that don't cut it, are actually assets that are, like, not Barkas, for example, or whatever it might be.
A jetty.
Or a jetty, of course, yeah. So there is huge expectations. You would think that there's going to be this continuation of the pipeline into the first team, and having the mechanisms to make sure that, because the players have been ID'd on, some sort of basis, if they don't work here, someone else will give them a shot. And if someone else gives them a shot and they're actually worth a crack, then you might actually come out of it in one piece. But I do think, like, the Salzburg reference is an interesting one there, because, like you say, they cracked a nut by spotting, like, North Africa, getting some academies in there, impoverished areas, trying, like, give them an access route, as it were, for any players that could make it. And now, like, say, look at Belgium, Denmark, Portugal, all these places now are just get academies all over the place. So great for that region and all the rest of it. But yeah, Celtic should be looking to, like, carve out their own edge, their own little angle of, this is how we're going to try and pull players up. And the frustrating thing, I was going to say sad, but the frustrating thing I think a lot of Celtic fans have is that our best transfers under Brendan 2.0 are out the phone book, for the most part. It's Brendan going back down to the Prem and just seeing who's kind of around. He was that guy at Norwich. He played good against me one time. He might do for us, or Schlupp, or that kind of thing. And it's not the inspired, like, we've done a bit of homework, we've done a bit of legwork, we've been keeping an eye on this player, we think it's about time to bring him in. Like, the Kvitsgarden thing is the one that, the saga, most people are probably somewhat familiar with, and it's there's certainly a lot left to be desired still in terms of the progression that we had here. But it was like there was like a false dawn with this, like when we sold Juranovic and brought in AJ, like, at the same time, and we thought, wow, we had Giacomakis and Kyogo. I was like, we've not had this in a while. And there was a few little, I say false dawn's probably the best way of putting it. So a lot of expectation and pressure on those guys to actually bring the dawn, as it were, coming into this campaign. But one thing sorry if you've got to.
Well, no, I was just going to say, one of the things I like to do periodically is I'll just go back to, it's real easy in Y Scout. You just go to a game report and you pull up who played that game. And I'll go back to like 17, 18, or even the Invincible season, 18, 19, 19, 20. You just kind of look at how games progressed, the selections, who was available, and you look at the level and the quality of players that we had at that through those seasons. And again, it changed, but there was a lot of talent in those teams. Talent that went on to play at good levels and be productive. Not all of which that we monetized, but they were really good. And I guess that's when I say I haven't seen much progress. Like I would say our overall talent level is not as good as it was back during those seasons. Kind of quality depth and even kind of high end. I've joked on our show, where there was that glimpse of time in summer of 2018 when we had the possibility of it being and Brendan even talked about going like 3-4-1-2 or 3-5-2 with Edouard and Dembele, and we were going to sign Castagna as right wing back. We were going to have Tierney as left wing back. You could have had a midfield of a peak prime McGregor, Christie, and Cham, Rogic, right? That's a good freaking team. That is really, really good. And we were right, and that's even going above beyond the possibility of we tried to sign McGinn and obviously didn't succeed.
Yeah.
So we went from that to now if we have one guy get hurt, we're like, holy shit, what's on the bench?
Yeah.
It's like, so even that 1920 team, I mean, you look at how good some of those guys were, and we didn't profile right. We didn't put them in, necessarily the best positions, but guys like Frimpong, you had El Yunusi, who's been a really good player at kind of our level, like the Midtjylland level, and very productive in Europe. So we've had a lot of these kind of players, and I just don't see our talent level being. And part of that's because the market's been moving; it's been inflating so much, and all the resources are kind of sucking up into the top 5 leagues. It's gotten harder to do it, and you have to be smarter and more clever. You have to be smarter at doing it. I mean, that's how Bloom's been doing what he's done at USG, and that's how Midtjylland's been able to continue to punch above their weight in some of these other clubs, because they're really they're prioritizing kind of the intellectual part of this, and so that's the part where I get upset, is because you think about what could have been with some of those talent levels, and then where we're kind of at now, and that's why I talk about the risk of the summer. If we lose a couple of these guys, it's who we replace them with, who's in charge of that, how are they being sourced, what's the process, because I just the evidence not there.
No, it's not. And I think like a big part of that, like you say, everyone's got their own kind of, you mentioned it earlier, their own kind of operating, environment sort of thing. So everyone's got their own situation to deal with, their own kind of thing to maximize. And as much as like, I think the Celtic fans as a whole, like we all want the club to do the best it possibly can. In Brendan's own words, he's got no problem selling Celtic to players. It's just a matter of shillings for the most part of what gets deals done, and not, from what we're led to believe anyway, it's not much in it. Maybe somebody paid a wee bit more, or we're trying to snaggle a wee deal down because that's what we love to do, and somebody else just comes in and pays the bloody money. But the flip side to that as well, which gives us a lot of frustration, is that like I say, the talent level isn't going up. And I don't think throughout those years we had any talent coming through the youth academy or anything like that. A lot of the transfers we're doing are a lot of the squad that we have are brought in. They're transferred in, and the club seem to have done a lot of stuff. And I'm always quite hesitant to jump on their back at this moment for the youth development, because at the moment there is going to be a lot of change on youth development with the facilities that they're creating and all the rest of it. So they have identified that it's been below par and they've spent a lot of money towards it. So it's like, well, just need to give them a bit of time now, and they've got their own rope to hang themselves with. If they spend all this money, we still kind of get players sold in a couple of years' time, or 5 years, whatever. Then different story. But one of the big chats, I'll throw this name at you since we're talking about analytics, and really, like James, I think we're both in agreement that clubs of our kind of ilk that want to be Champions League level player trading model, the transfer policy has to be kind of process over results. And what I mean by that, for if I can put that properly, is like you stick to the process even if like we do have a bad window or whiff it once or twice. Now that might might just give a wee bit of reassurance maybe to the current strategy. I don't want to do that, because like the transfer windows haven't been terrible overall. If you were to be super analytical on the money in and out, we very rarely get a net spend, so I don't mean
Right.
in that sense. But I mean, like when you look at the Brightons and the USGs or whatever, they profile players on very many different things. I remember one of the famous ones that came out of one of the Salzburg, like one of the books that one of the people wrote that was like, might have been Houllier, but one of the people that was like the kind of forebearers of the founding fathers of that stuff was they didn't want to sign anyone that had tattoos, and they had like an age range, and they had something else. It was like a few kind of funky things. And anyway, even if they imagine they lose out on a player like, I know he doesn't probably have many tattoos, but let's just say Mbappe. Let's imagine they didn't sign Mbappe because he's got tattoos. They're not going to
Right.
just throw their plan out the window because like, we could have got Mbappe, but we didn't because of all the success that they had. And it feels like we are like, if we have a bad window, it's like, fuck, right, what do we do? Reinvent the wheel and go back to square one. So I'll kind of throw it back to you on that one in terms of like full agreement with you on process and all the rest of it. One of the main questions, or one of the main names that's getting thrown at us at the moment in this vein is Lennon Miller. And Lennon Miller, like, would he become like, would he be a process kind of guy if we went after him? I'm not too convinced we will, to be honest with you, right? But
Yeah.
guy in the league, up and coming, hot prospect, or is this another one of, we've been getting guys from like Sweden and Argentina and they've not worked out. So let's just go
Right.
back to the native one.
Yeah. So this is where as the a-hole American outsider with the douchebag accent, when I say what I'm about to say, I have some self-awareness with this, but as an outsider, relative outsider, my observation has been that Scottish football culture is incredibly hard on domestic players. Again, if you look back at how Christie was kind of treated relative to,
Yeah.
and I don't mean like in a personal way. I'm just saying like the collective kind of median narrative and perception of his quality at Celtic, I thought was well below like how good of a player he was. And again, some of it had to do with he was misused. He wasn't put in the roles that he probably should have been. So, it's tough. Like some of these guys, what was his name? Hinkie? No, what was his name? The right back for Hearts. He went to Italy.
Hickey.
Hickey. Yeah, Hickey. That's my Philadelphia 76ers brain fart. He was a famous general manager at the Sixers in the NBA. Yeah, so Hickey, he was a 17-year-old right back starting at Hearts and playing well. Was he tearing the world down? No, but he was 17, right? When you have guys playing in, first division of a decent league at that age and holding up physically and performing at a high valued position, right? That's a fairly high value position. That you have to assume that he's going to develop, and like the vast majority of Celtic supporters at the time that I was aware of were like, this guy's shite, he's terrible. Why we sign a guy from Hearts? He stinks. Like he's not going to be any good. And then he goes, it's Ferguson. Ferguson's been a
Yeah.
good midfielder, and there's a whole different complication given the name and the pedigree there. But again, Aberdeen player, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's that kind of internal negativity bias. Like if I was Lennon Miller's father or his agent, I'd be like, life might be better if you go to Italy. Like you can develop, you can, deal with your career and maybe grow as an individual, a human being living in another country, some of these other, things that parents might concerned about with their children, as far as an opportunity. So I would actually see it be a reciprocal issue, meaning that if I'm Lennon Miller planning my career, I probably don't want to stay in Scotland, period. And I get why
Yeah.
a lot of domestic kids wouldn't want to do that. And that's horribly unfortunate. And I wish Celtic would sign all of the best players from domestically. So I think there's that component. And I think that's part of why some of these kids leave above and beyond the financial aspect of it. I love Lennon Miller. I would love if Celtics sign him. My work that I do as far as analyzing player profiles, and believe me, I'm not pretending I'm Tony Bloom, but I do kind of come my professional background's in kind of adjacent areas of analytics. Financial markets are not that different from professional gambling. So,
Sure.
it's about risk and reward. When do you, put chips in the middle, that kind of thing. And the way I've built my process to analyze players, the one thing I might be worried about is he may not have like that high end athleticism as far as like speed and burst, right? So that's fine, but he looks like he's got IQ, and that above. And Alan and I have been kind of working on this over time, and I have my own kind of framework that I have, trying to identify players that have spatial intelligence, have good decision making. They kind of just, those players that have an intuition for the game, that kind of thing. Go across sports, you see different types of guys that are like that. They're playing chess when everyone else is playing checkers. And when you see a guy that's 17, 18 doing that, you're like, boom, right? That, to use another basketball analogy, Larry Bird was like that. Larry Bird could barely jump over a phone book, but he was, playing 2-3 steps ahead. And that's LeBron. LeBron thinks 2-3 step. There we go. Right. Yeah. So that's what a lot of these guys get. And which again, it's fair enough. All players get that. It seems to me a little bit overwrought. So yeah, I'd love to see him get signed and put in a role. Like this go back to our philosophical disagreement probably on midfielders, particularly defensive midfielders. But to me, particularly if we're going to continue, and we may not, particularly if McGregor is going to be anchored as a starter going into next season, maybe we'll go to a double pivot. But if we're going to stick with 4-3-3 or a single pivot, I think you want that middle guy to be a really smart player. They're the quarterback of build-up. They're the fulcrum of everything that goes on the pitch, and I think that's where McGregor gets undervalued by some in our support. And I think Miller could be someone like that. Now that comes back to, well, then do you sign him because he's not going to play because your captain's going to play? And if, can you play McGregor as an attacking 8 now? I don't think you can in Europe for sure. I mean, you could get away with it domestically, but so there you get into squad planning. And this goes back to, did we learn any lessons from the Scott Brown end of his career, how he was clogging up? We were giving, he was lockdown starter, sucking up all those minutes basically from the 18-19 season on. So 3 extra seasons where his role should have been like gutted, not only just phased out, like 18-19, he should have already been, in my opinion, moved to like a part-time player, important, but part-time, limited minutes, because he was blocking guys like Christie, he was blocking guys like Rogic and Cham and McGregor, like playing together. We had that little glimpse in the Europa League where we like went toe to toe with RB Leipzig and Salzburg in midfield. And I was like, wow, young guys running around. It's like, this is what a revelation. So, that planning and prioritizing, I think. So are we going to sign Lennon Miller and then put him in a role and use him and progress his career and development in a way that makes sense for all parties involved? I'd be concerned about that if I was in his camp. But I'd love it. Like, I'd love him to be signed and then become a regular, maybe not lockdown first team starter, but a material part of the squad and getting lots of starts. Because I think he's hugely talented.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think he is, like, he's going to have early signs would tell us I think he's going to have a great career. And I very much echo your own thoughts on it. I've been kind of saying it here for the last kind of month or so, I think. But like, unless Itate's sold or even Engels, I don't think that's going to happen. But I don't think there's any incentive for Lennon Miller to come here, because like the main incentive would be to play Champions League. He's been playing Scottish League for the last little while. Sure, it'd be for a dominant team rather than Motherwell, right? There's an advantage there. There's some development there. But if he's not going to be getting like 80% of the minutes, 3/4 of the minutes available, over the course of the season, his development won't be it won't be maximised. And you'll look at guys like Lewis Ferguson who went to Bologna. Now Bologna got into the Champions League and have maybe became a wee bit more of a respectable transfer. But
Not
like
when
when
he
he
went
went
there.
there, yeah, that was not the case. Adam Ida, who was like that close to joining Verona. If you look at Verona's ins and outs over the last 4 years, by the way, you'll be so surprised at how many like big money transfer fees that they've got, and some of the like he played there. Now he's like at Napoli, or maybe somebody in the Premier League or whatever. So he if Lennon Miller goes to like Cagliari or whatever, right, just to throw a random name out there, it's not that slight on Celtic or anyway like that at all. But it's just like there's an environment there, obviously, where they're getting minutes. It's a league where IQ is tested. It's a league where there is like the fans are all pretty intense and all the rest of it, and like you say, lifestyle comes into it as well. So I find unless it's with Soltitati and you're playing with Engels and McGregor, I don't think it's going to happen, no matter what the wages are, unless it's like stupid, which Celtic would never do, of course. So I think
Well,
yeah.
Well, and that's for guys that may not have that high end elite athleticism. I think going to Italy or Spain makes a lot of sense. Like
Yeah,
when there
slower.
was well, it's just it's not as guys flying around like lunatics like you
Yep.
get in UK football. So when O'Reilly it was kind of down to Brighton and Atalanta. Like my feeling for his career was even if the money was a little lower, Atalanta made a lot more sense because it's not quite at that level of boom, boom, boom like you get in the Premier League. Now, in fairness to him, and that early injury I think has set him back, but yes, I think there's a lot of benefit for guys like that, particularly in that development arc. What you don't want to do is put them in an environment where their strengths are kind of underweighted as far as how they'll compete situationally, and their weaknesses get hammered because then you fall into confidence issues and those kind of things. So that's where you get back to these issues of profiling. And one of the things I think Bloom's doing very well in his clubs, and to a lesser extent, what was his name? Benford, I forget his name. The guy from Brentford is
His name.
yeah, but Benham is almost like a laundering. So he's recruiting guys that fit certain systems and their profiles are ideal or close to ideal for how they're going to be utilized. And then they can turn around and sell them to dumb money for, like Casado. Casado's a good midfielder, but he was like ideally suited for how he was playing in Brighton. And they turn around and sell him for, what was it, 75 or 80 million to the dum-dums at Chelsea, right?
Yeah.
Kind of prototypical dumb money. So it really does come down to a huge part of this, because when you're shopping in bands, like the market isn't that inefficient where, I'm Celtic, I can pay a guy 20 grand a week like that. This is my universe of players. Well, these are the guys that, don't have drug problems and, aren't out carousing. Like you start chopping down your addressable universe. These are the guys that don't want to come to Scotland, and you keep going down and down and down. And then you get to guys that, oh, okay, well, how will they fit? And it's those, on the margin, how do you pick up marginal gains on profile fit? That's why I thought, oh Jesus, my brain, I swear to God, guy we signed from Dundee, McCowan. McCowan, again, he's not going to be a world beater, but his profile was one that his strengths fit with how we played domestically, particularly against bottom six teams. I lovingly call him a hurricane. Like he comes on and just is like a storm of activity and chaos. And a lot of it ends up, particularly being on an imposing dominant team like we are against bottom half clubs. I mean, he just creates, and he can, he's one of those people that can unlock that low block. And sometimes it's because of vision and a great pass. Sometimes it's just because it's, chaos.
Yeah.
He's good at creating chaos. So I thought that was a smart signing. He has a role, a very, for the value that we're paying him and the transfer fee. I thought it was a really good investment based off of what the team can get out of him if he's used properly. starting in the Champions League is not the way that you use him properly.
No.
Having no depth and him being one of your starters against Rangers in a derby, probably not, where he's going to be a major difference maker. So yes, that's where I think if I'm Lennon Miller, like I get to a club that makes sense for his development arc, probably in Italy or Spain or so, one of those more second gear leagues that aren't playing at flying fast pace all the time.
Yeah, I'm with you there all the way. And I think like that kind of the reason that kind of came in is we're kind of chatting about the transfer progression, the need for like some extra midfield reinforcements, maybe a bit of an increase in like not an increase probably is the wrong word, but like a double down on like this is how Rodgers wants his midfield built with the next transfer, because it feels like Engels was very much a eggs in one basket, 13 million, get him. He is definitely going to be fitting the prototype of kind of what I want. I just want to quickly come back to River and the Sea here. Spain, you honestly, like I watch so much La Liga football and it is the slowest football you will watch. Now, there's lots of quick guys, they're mainly wingers, but the football, the pace of the game is super slow. Same as Italy. What's his name? Liam Henderson still plays Serie A football, by the way, for what it's worth, So like, it's just I promise you, it's a different tempo. There's still rapid guys there, but it's a different kind of matter what we're kind of saying there. So if we
and
go
you
on
could
this,
real quick, there are statistical measures that are available that kind of support that. So this is not just a kind of Quinny and I pulling that out of our rear ends, or we feel that way because we watch. And obviously you can get that sense by watching, but there are different metrics like passing rate and like how quickly is the ball moving, and guys running, like how much are guys carrying the ball and how quickly are they doing it. So I just wanted to mention that. It's not like we're just completely making this up.
I know, of course, love it. And I say like you keep yourself far better.
Not that I'm
abreast
above that
of all these
sometimes.
things. Yeah. Than I do myself. I try and get myself across as much as I can. But one thing I love listening to your stuff, which by the way, Juco James, your Twitter and your Huddle Breakdown YouTube channel, everything's linked in the description of the video, by the way, if you're watching this live or after we've been live. If you haven't done so already, be sure to follow them, drop a follow, drop a sub, and all that good stuff as well for some great content. Because that's one of the things where, like, when I listen to you guys, like, you do use lots of different vendors on occasion for stats. I know you and Alan obviously collect your own stuff, but you kind of go out, into OBV and, there's lots of other stuff that you guys tackle with. So love to hear a little bit of backup for the eye test there coming out there. So that's always lovely. But this kind of is the number one kind of transfer problem, kind of. We could chat about left back perhaps in our time, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how long you've got with us, so I'll kind of jump on.
I'm good. However long you want to go, I'm good.
Oh, good. Because we managed to get together, James. I had the pleasure of joining you guys last international break on the Huddle Breakdown, as I mentioned. But this actually came about because we had a lovely interaction on Twitter from Ryan Conlon. So fist bump to you. Hail. Thanks very much for coming in and suggesting we get together and tackle something. And what Ryan in particular was after, I'll just zoom in on this for anyone at home, is how we can go through 3 derby matches and seemingly not learn anything. And although we've come out of it with a cup, we're certainly not coming out of these games with bragging rights or a sense of confidence or, anything like that, And for me, a big part of what's kind of went on over the last 3 derby games, you mentioned McKeown playing in the last one, of course. For me, a lot of it has been the midfield. I don't want to say battle, because I don't think it's been a case of where
have you heard that before?
Battle as such, but like we've kind of let ourselves down, perhaps. I missed what you said there. Sorry, so I was talking, but what I was going to say is like, yeah. So over the last 3 games, James, we've kind of the last 3 derby matches, we've been more frustrated than happy, haven't we?
Hugely. We were fortunate to win the cup, I think. We went toe to toe, but the way that went, and we certainly been rare over the years, at least the recent history. But we benefited from a refereeing decision there. It was material, so that was glorious in its irony. But yeah, and then so each one of these games has its own kind of, I think, way to attribute them. The January 2nd one, I wasn't all that bothered by, just because it looked like we looked like a team that was completely out of gas, and in a game that, realistically, where you're looking at the because people respond to incentives, motivations, and they had much more, and their manager had much more reasons at that point to be highly motivated. And they were playing at Ibrox, and we were a team that kind of played like we weren't all of that. And not that guys weren't competitive or didn't care, but we're talking about 1-2% margin type stuff here, where you're either going like a crazy person going to run through a brick wall level, or you're giving, like 99%. And I think we were the latter to a degree in that game. And that's what I think why we look so awful, is because it kind of wed those two games where I think the cup final, we were at 100%. And then we kind of just notched back a bit. And I think this most recent derby was kind of a combination of those two, in that we're still not, we're not really playing for anything in that game, when I say, other than pride, right? And as much as we care about these games, and I'm sure even Rodgers, to a material degree, for a variety of reasons, really cares about it, the players are human beings. And, they're not morons. They understand what the league table is. And right. So
Yeah.
are they completely, gung ho, militantly maniacal focused on this game like you and I would be, that live, eat, and breathe this stuff? Maybe not. And maybe Rangers were at least on parity, or maybe a little more intense in the game, which I think, is surprising to some, but it wouldn't shock me if like that was kind of close, or even they edged us in that way. And then our depth just wasn't there. I mean, we basically had to play the three midfielders the entire game. And yes, they were fatigued coming off the Fenerbahce game, but an extra time. But yeah, I will say though that there's a hugely important tactical part to this, which is, and I've been talking about this all season on Huddle Breakdown. What I said that I spoke while you were speaking rudely, I apologize.
That's
Was
okay.
I had made a, as your poor viewers are learning, if they haven't been victimized by listening to me before, I can be long-winded and blather on for far too long. And I went on one of these after the first derby of the season, when I was generally very complimentary of the performance, but I said, oh, by the way, like, it was a fairly nuanced analysis that I had, as far as I didn't think that what the midfielders could control. So I thought Clement shat it on tactics. I thought Brendan really hammered him on tactics in the game. But that on the margin, their midfielders had kind of matched up pretty well and maybe edged it, won the midfield battle, is how I said it on the day. And the reason why I said that was because I was worried that if a team adopted what Bruges deployed against us, particularly in the first half, and then effectively what Rangers have done in the last three, which is let our center backs have the ball, be smart with the press, and man mark the midfield. That's I've called it the Bruges script. I think we have major issues with that. And I think it's a personnel issue. I think it's a relative, against this profile issue of the relative strengths and weaknesses of our players and how they're being used. I don't think I think that will inherently give us challenges because of who we have. And then I don't think we've done a great job in making the adjustments required in order to combat it, knowing that those aren't going to be perfect or ideal, because of the manager can only use the parts that are the players that are at his disposal. And then McGregor being out just made that even worse. And it has a lot to do with how we handle buildup, and that we don't have, we have Alan coined the phrase toxic combination, which I love, a few seasons ago. Yeah. And, this goes back to three mistakes is oftentimes what leads to a goal. So when you have multiple players that are in the similar proximity, that have the interlinking of their relative strengths and weaknesses, their weaknesses line up, that can be a toxic combination, and it can create like a major problem in, debilitating aspects of our play or empowering the opposition. And I think one of our main issues in build-up is we don't have ball playing players in the back, particularly left center back, right center back, and right back. Like, they're okay if they're not put under serious pressure, but if they're in a really well coached with smart pressing triggers, and are just given the ball and their passing options are defended intelligently, I think they struggle. And I don't think they're I don't think that's their strengths. And then we have midfielders like Bernardo, Engels, McCowan to a large degree, that it's not their strength to create space because they're not the most athletic, dynamic, quick, and that they're not the most technically gifted at, this is where Hatate, I think, is a little bit better at creating that little bit of space and taking the ball with the right body shape and turning and being able to, move the ball up the pitch. So those guys, the vast majority of the time, will just get the ball and pass it right back or sideways maybe. They're not really helping carve teams open when they take the risk of pressing. And when they do their defensive overloads with triggers. So I think that's why we've had this problem in these games, and I don't think that's going to get fixed until we change personnel or we change setup. And might help. What my preference is that you would have McGregor next to Hatate in buildup, because then they have two guys that are at least capable of helping that buildup. And for a while now, the solution has been to invert the left back, and Taylor is okay at that in buildup. Again, not at that level of like European level, smart athletic pressing. Schlupp might be, but in fairness to him, we just signed a dude. He didn't even go through a preseason. He wasn't playing left back. He sure as hell wasn't playing a left inverted left back with this toxic combination of other guys whose distribution may not be great. So maybe he can turn into that, but in fairness to him, that's a tough thing to just get plopped down into and be a high functioning inverted left back and build up. So that's kind of I'd like to see it tried anyway. And I think we did see it to a degree in the second half. But it's tough because they really fatigued and the intensity of their press really dropped back. But when Hatate was dropping back in the second half of the latest derby, I thought he made a big difference in, playing deep and helping that build up. Because he's also the huge threat to play the ball over the top and break lines that way. So
yeah,
that's my harebrained idea.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And it's interesting because you've said two things there that I haven't really considered myself. And I kind of lay, as I said, at the kind of tip off of this, I suppose, like that I lay a lot of the blame and a lot of the focus over these derby matches for whatever way they've went, even the final, of course, where we've ended up winning it, at midfield in terms of like their ability to, find the space, create the, opportunities on the half turn to get some stuff. Because Carter Vickers, like, as much as I love the guy, and I think every Celtic fan does as well, one of the things I always call him on this channel, like a level one, like a basic level passer, because he genuinely, like, and I don't know if you've seen the reaction to America versus Canada last night, but there's some, like, there's some US men's national team, USMNT, analysis out there where they are like, Carter Vickers can't pass the ball into the final, like, he can't go long, it's a very obvious thing that he's lacking. It's been one of the reasons I've been such a big fan of Scales. And one of the things that I've said about Scales, like, it's not necessarily that he's the answer to this problem, right? But I think it highlights the fact that we've brought Trusty in for £6 million. And I'm still hearing people tell me that maybe Scales is a better passer than him. But the thing with Scales is, and just the defence in general, to upgrade on what we had last year, Scales and Vickers isn't Austin Trusty, really. Like, Trusty's been great. I think he's made the defence a little bit better because I think there's a nice bit of synergy there. He's a little bit quicker. He does have some positives, but to upgrade on what Scales and Vickers was last year to kind of compensate for that kind of toxic. I've heard Alan say that before, but I never really knew the full meaning of it. So I love the breakdown on that as well. So thanks, James. Would cost way more than what Trusty cost, probably double. To have somebody of that physique, of some sort, you're after a guy mid-ish 20s that can also like play a pass that can cut some space open. And like I've always put the focus for that problem this season on the midfield, but you are quite right in highlighting the fact that, like the defense do carry a big burden for that as well because of their like shortcomings. Probably the best way of putting it.
Well, and that's even with, Ange ball, the Starfelt had recovery pace like that.
Yeah.
That was, he was able to be, the center back who dove in and and when it didn't work out, he wasn't able to intercede. He could get back because he was very rapid in that recovery pace. I think Trusty, to a degree, is similar. But I think Trusty's also similar in the sense that he's very, I mean, I think he's even worse than Carter Vickers in that sense. Like he needs to keep his passing simple. He's not someone who's going to, you know, I think Carter Vickers is a compiler in passing data. You know, that's one thing that there are guys who their stats can look good, but it's more so on the edges as far as they're not being stress tested. And I think Alistair Johnston is that way too. And this is an inherent challenge that Celtic have. I shouldn't say Celtic have, but people who analyze Celtic have, is we're so dominant and guys can rack up such good numbers because of that disparity in quality against the vast majority of the domestic league, that you don't really see it until they get stress tested in Europe. And that's why, I think Alistair Johnston, like his spatial intelligence, I always joke on our show, I use a ton of North American sports analogies. And the one I've used for this is, this is like if you're a quarterback in the NFL and, there's certain reads that quarterbacks make pre-snap, they call it. They're trying to identify, are they in man-to-man? Are they in zone? Where's the free safety at? Are they what they call cover two? Are they too deep with the safeties? And the reason why you need to be thoughtful about all these things is that when you have a route runner, a guy run a pattern, you need to know if it's being, covered by one guy, or if he cuts in and the safety comes in, he can jump the route. And you think your guy's open and you throw the ball and then you go, oh, fuck. And a guy just picks it and goes the other way. And I think we saw that a lot in this Bruges script, is that when teams have let our back four have the ball and not really pressure them, but they're man marking in midfield and the wingers and the fullbacks to a degree, depending on the side, they're jumping our routes. So guys look open, but we're not used to having the athleticism or the intelligence of the trapping that was being set up in Europe with some of these teams. And we saw that to a lesser degree in the 21, 22 and 22, 23 season when Bassi would man mark Rogic. I don't know if you remember that, right? Mm-hmm. Basically shut him down. Like Rogic got man marked out of the game and Bassi would jump routes. And guys look open, but they're not open if the guy's really quick and really strong and, can jump the passing lane. And I think we saw that repeatedly at the European level, not only for Carter Vickers, Johnston. I think that very much is Trusty. And I agree with you. I think Scales has the technical ability, and I think his visual intelligence is, spatial intelligence has vastly improved. And I think he's quite good now picking the guy out. Where I think he falls down is that translation from seeing it to technical ability to make the decision quickly, kind of speed of thought, and then deliver it technically all at once. So this is what makes guys really, really good. This is the difference between, a 50 million pound center back and, a guy who's not, is, Van Dijk can put all of that together and run, 35 kilometers per hour
and take free kicks.
Right. And be 6'4" and handsome and all these other horrible things that some of us are jealous about. So I agree with you. We kind of, and this is where, again, the mixing, right? So if you have Trusty and Carter Vickers, if you've decided that that's your center back pairing, how do you then do your buildup knowing that you've got two center backs that are basically simple first level passers, and your right back is a little rough when put under coverage, meaning that you can leave him out of the ball and then he has trouble with man coverage at the next level. And that's, I think, what we've been confronting. And so when I see clubs that come up with this recipe, is, to his credit, he didn't survive long after he did it, but Clement figured it out for the cup final. And they, again, to Ferguson's credit, to a large degree, they stuck with it in their most recent derby. I don't know. Like, I don't think, Carter Vickers and Trusty are magically going to become good passers when I say good, meaning sophisticated passers.
Expansive.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Right. And I think John, these guys are all kind of in their age curve where they're kind of what they are. They might have a little bit of development, but they're probably about what they're going to be. So yeah, how we solve that is the hard part.
Yeah. And I think Taylor previously has been like the kind of cheat code. Like, I've been a big fan of Taylor on this channel as well. Like, I love the wild card element that we've seen, especially when Ange was here. And I know Brendan kind of let him carry the torch for a bit last year, and we're maybe seeing that phased out as we expect the return of Tierney, of course, in the summer, and that'll probably just be back to mirror image left and right back kind of situation. And when you take that, like, the Taylor aspect has been a really big difference maker, especially domestically, because, like, very famously under Ange, he'd pop up in right wing, centre forward. He was one of our most creative players. So much so, like the derby you mentioned there, this is the second thing you mentioned that I didn't really think about, and that was maybe pairing Hatate and McGregor together, like, deep in the engine room to collect the ball from the back. Because I make you totally right that the second half of the last derby, like, for me, what I'd seen happen was in the first half, Hatate was still in that kind of press support position where he's helping the front three kind of do their thing.
Yep.
And it was McCowan and Engels that were doing that, and McCowan just couldn't get the ball across the halfway line. Second half, McCowan was chucked up there, and Hatate was given. Now, Hatate for me in that game was somewhat omnipresent. I was watching it at home on the TV. Almost every frame of the camera, Hatate was somewhere to be seen, even in the first half. Second half, it felt like he was much more of like, you're back there. Like, you're going to get us across the halfway line from back there. You're going to do it. And that's where I think a lot of the difference was in the second half. So, yeah, potentially, like, there's a development there. But I do think that if we do keep Hatate, I'm maybe 60-40 that Hatate is not going anywhere, because I just don't see there being a queue, especially because Celtic will have a figure, and, chances of that getting met, I don't see as being quite slim. But Hatate and McGregor as a kind of double pivot, or a two-man engine room or whatever, could be quite a nice solution. And then ask the question of what you do with Engels, because I actually think on midfield, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, right? But I actually think Engels' best work in the midfield is when he's been on the left, and it's normally when he started over Hatate. Sometimes he's played with Engels, pardon me, with Kevin, I beg your pardon, or maybe even Bernardo on occasion. So he's on that left, which is normally, like, if Hatate's playing, he's always on the left, on that side of the pitch. So again, yeah, if you do that with Hatate and McGregor, it maybe opens some sort of different thing for Engels, because we've not seen him overly deployed in the Matt O'Reilly shift, because Matt O'Reilly used to be the press support for quite a bit. Hatate would do it as well, but O'Reilly was right into it, and Engels isn't really. So I never really considered that, and that's quite a bit of food for thought as well.
Well, and this goes back to the kind of, and I actually wrote my weekly, I do a column once a week, at least, for Huddle Breakdown. And today's was basically looking at this idea of, we need to sign a Wanyama. And the issue being that would likely improve us defensively in that zone, but it's much more complicated than that. This is like we talked about, just going over, like, how do these pieces of the puzzle connect with one another, and how there can be unintended consequences and kind of cascading effects based off of relative strengths and weaknesses of how the players fit together. And this goes back to profile. So Engels, to me, is he's very good at delivering long balls. Like, he's a brilliant long ball deliverer, whether it's the long diagonals or just over the top. Like, from deep, he's very good at that. Wide crosses, he's pretty good at delivering wide crosses into the box. I have to say that's probably about it that as far as, and dead ball, he's again, similarly, those are all kind of related, right? From a technical ability perspective, they're like, cousins, so to speak, or adjacent. Outside of that, I'm like, well, okay, what else does he do where you say it pops? Yeah. He's not that fast. He's not that big. He's not that strong. His technical ability is not that good. He hasn't been that attacking. So how do you leverage someone like that? Honestly, I don't know what the answer is, because we don't play 4-4-2. Right. So I would probably put him as a wide right midfielder in a 4-4-2 or something similar to that, where a lot of those abilities would be more leveraged. I think probably the least bad option for us is him as part of a 2 in again, the double pivot. So this goes back. I will be really surprised if we don't end up going back to a 4-2-3-1 next season. But I'd like to hear what your thought is. I don't see how you have Kieran Tierney as your return of the prodigal son, and nominally, I think legitimately, probably the best player on the team, and then ask him to play a role that he is not that well suited for. Like, he's not an inverted left back. Like, that's pretty much why he didn't stick at Arsenal. He's a flying up and down left wing, fullback.
Do you not feel like Schlupp's been a wee bit of the handover period, but from Taylor to Tierney maybe? Because Schlupp, like you say, he's not been really doing that inverted thing. He kind of tucks in a wee bit once in a while.
Yeah. So I'd like us to sign. So this goes back to, how do you get smart and model some of the stuff? So this is not something like some revelatory insight. It's happened, a lot of what I produce relative to football and Celtic specifically, I'm stealing from watching what's happened in other sports for the last 20 years. So the market dynamics have been the same in every sport as the analytics revolution has taken over, which is you go from young players being undervalued, then the pendulum swinging too far and people paying too much for young talent and starting to undervalue veterans, like the 30 plus guys who all of a sudden, they were getting massively overpaid on reputation, and they're still getting capped the most for international football and all this other stuff. And, so they're getting these big fat salary contracts and getting big transfer fees. That's all collapsing now. And so you're going to have more and more guys like Schlupp who are really good players. Yes, they're getting older. Yes, he's not the guy he was 2 years ago, but he's declining off a English Premier League level midfielder winger that could be a starting left center midfielder for us, I think. And particularly put through a full season. Like, he could be the Hatate replacement if Hatate leaves. I would be okay with that. He brings a lot of those elements that I've talked about. But I don't, and he would have that utility. There's that huge value in positional, flexibility that again, as you go through a season, having guys that can produce at a quality level, maybe not their best level, but they're better than some other guy. In baseball, they call it above replacement level. So if you're just going to kind of call up a guy from the minor leagues, if you're better than that dude, then you're a utility person. So I think Schlupp could be that, both at, be the starting left central midfielder, because why else is he going to come to Celtic? Like, he's not going to come to Celtic to ride the bench at his point in his career with the money that he's made down south. So most likely, that's my view. So if he would say, okay, you're going to be a starting left central midfielder, you get some minutes at wing and you get some minutes at fullback, like, that's a really valuable player. But again, why would we run a system where our best player is not being asked to do the thing that he's the best at? And that's Tierney rampaging up and down. So let him do that and go back to the double pivot. And so more what Rodgers did in much of his first tenure, with the difference being that, and this goes back to my bias, you don't have, a Badler central midfielder, defensive midfielder clogging things up, slowing the play down. Like, you need those people. So that's why even if it is Hatate and McGregor and that dual pivot, most of defending is, you're the tactics guy.
Glad you think so.
Way more. Way more than I am. It's mostly about positioning and coaching and discipline and being smart. Yes, winning your man-to-man battles is important on the margin, but generally it's being, well organized and guys doing their job and not being stupid and making mistakes. So if you can eliminate most of that, you're just positionally smart, we'd be fine vast majority of the time. And it's not ideal, I grant you that, but Hatate and McGregor in a dual pivot, or McGregor Engels. I don't think Engels is good enough on the ball and build up, preferably for me, but so it would be maybe McGregor and Schlupp, and then you got to figure out who's that 10, and that could have been Kvistgarden if we signed him a year ago, but yeah, so that's why I think we might go back to the double pivot but they're the big issue then is the 10. Who's going to be the 10? Because it's not Engels, it's not Bernardo. I think McCowan can play it again against bottom half
The right
teams.
opposition. Yeah.
Yeah. But then that's who you have to sign an elite for us, like spend the kind of money that you did on Engels, only do it smart and well profiled for somebody that can play that 10.
I think the question you kind of posed there, I suppose, is like it's kind of like how do you get the most, or how do you not handicap Tierney's upgrade? Kind of the way it should feel, as well as like how do you get the most out of Engels? And I think whenever I'm kind of looking at Engels, like I agree with kind of everything you said about him for the most part. I will say, but I think what we've seen from him against Bayern Munich, where he was like man for man with Goretzka, who's like one of the best box to box kind of midfielders that's been around for a wee while. It gave me a wee bit of like reason to be hopeful that some of his shortcomings can be bridged maybe sooner rather than later, or just eventually, I suppose. But when I think about Engels and how to get the most out of him, I'm often reminded, or what comes to my mind, I should say, sorry, is like I did a lot of analysis on my own chat, like my 23,001 channel, where I kind of cover just general football and fantasy football and whatever. But I covered a lot of Newcastle over the last like 2 or 3 years, and their midfield model like is quite. It's not terribly unique, right? But it's quite deliberate. And the way they've got their free midfield, I think I mentioned this on Axom a month or two ago, but all three of their midfielders do the same thing. Like if you look at any frame on screen, you'll see all three Newcastle midfielders in the final third kind of pressing the ball, maybe not gung-ho pressing, but they'll be involved in the shielded defence and whatever. And when the ball goes back, all three of them are going back and they're getting their hands dirty and they're getting up to their elbows in it. And they are super athletes. They're all like 6 foot. They're all from Brazil. They're all like, pretty much big power runners. And I think that's how you get the most out of Engels, is having another 2 Engels in that midfield.
Well, yeah, and that I like the way that you're thinking. The problem is McGregor's at least got another season.
And I think Rodgers wants that, and you're still going to you can't move McGregor, so it's a halfway house you're going to be in, isn't it?
Right, and that's in fairness. Like I'm. I was infamously upset about the Brown timeline.
Oh, no. I thought something else you were going to say there. Sorry.
No. Well, you tell me what you thought, but I don't see the parallels with Brown and McGregor. I mean, all players have an aging curve, but they're very different types of players, very difficult type of physical makeup. Brown had a renaissance to his credit when he kind of professionalized his lifestyle when Rodgers showed up. McGregor has been a lockdown professional the whole time, had a lot more mileage on him, which would be on the deficit side. But I think what McGregor's good at will age okay. He'll slow down, but his kind of simple game management, I think, will be fine. But it's going to be, probably this season, like this next season coming up, 25-26, probably should be at the European level the last time somebody like McGregor would be a lockdown starter at Celtic. The number of guys that are Modric, right? That's what makes him an exception to the rule. I mean, there's just very few guys who can age that way and they keep it up physically. They're just, they're mutants physically. So, I mean, but I don't like, what are the chances that he's not a starter in 2 seasons? Like the way Celtic have been run, I think probably pretty low. So then how do you manage that? Like if you're going to do that kind of thing, then you have to optimize based off of that. And that is not Engels, right? So that's why in my judgment, Engels was a bad signing, is because, let me ask you, like if he was on a loan to buy deal right now, what would you be willing to pay for Engels?
Great question. If he was on loan to buy, you would not be spending more than Ida. I would be thinking 7 or 8. I would think probably. The Belgium caps make it a bit muddy, because if we did loan him in and then he got capped the way he has, that just inflates transfer values. So like on the pitch, what we've seen, I wouldn't want to pay more than 7 or 8, but thinking about just general context and perception, maybe I would have been okay with it being like 12 or something, maybe because of that kind of X factor ability, because that is about resale value. And if you're getting caps for Belgium, makes most people quite resellable on surface level anyway. But that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I never thought about it in that sense. Because that's normally what we do with these guys is loan them in, try before we buy, whereas with Engels, we
Well,
just jumped in the deep end.
I think that's a simple way to kind of reframe it
Yeah.
and say, okay, like, and so again, this goes back to, uh, um, my history with financial markets is one of the worst things you can do as an investor is to lug along a loser.
Yeah.
Right. So if you've made a decision that is a bad decision, if you've made a bad investment, meaning that you've decided based off of this heuristic that this is going to be a sound investment, and then 9 months later something has changed, or your analysis stunk, or just the whole thing has shifted to the point where you realize, you know what? I mean, it was good faith. I tried my hardest. I screwed up. By the way, that's how things work. You're not going to be 100%. By lugging that mistake along, there's an opportunity cost.
Totally.
And not only is there opportunity cost financial, there's also mind share, meaning that you end up allocating a huge amount of focus onto something that's draining resources, rather than just dump that turd and go do something else. And I'm talking about an investment here. I'm not talking about Engels as far as that.
Yeah.
But that's the way like smart investors behave, is that when they recognize they've made a mistake, they act quick and they purge it. They get it out. And I think, like, how do you extricate yourself from a mistake? I think Engels was a mistake. I think Ida was a mistake. Ida's an easy one for people to see now, I think, given the season that he's had. Engels is understandably a more complicated situation because of his age, his pedigree, where he came from. And again, I'm not saying he's a bad player. I mean, this goes back to the importance of profile. Locker Bielka is a good player.
Yeah.
Navratsky is a
Jonah.
good player. Who's that? Who was the big, tall, handsome guy that Rangers signed to play number 10, and then he went on to FC 20? I forget his name,
Tillman?
but no, not Tillman. It was
No.
the next season. One of Beal's, that horrible window that Beal had over the summer. But anyway, so they signed him basically being
Lammers.
Sam Lammers, right? Sam Lammers is actually a pretty decent footballer if you put him in the right role, which they did at FC 20. So he's actually been productive there. So, that's what I was saying. You're shopping in a price band, how you profile these guys and put them in the right spot. And we've not done that for Engels. And again, it's not he's a bad player, doesn't have positives, or isn't talented, or like really talented. I just don't see how those talents are going to blossom into what they could be at Celtic, like Matt O'Reilly. Like they're very different players, but O'Reilly's strengths were kind of tailor-made to blossom at Celtic because of his IQ, like his playing IQ. That's why, again, same thing with Lennon Miller. So, I would like, I'm of the philosophy, because we have such a strong balance sheet financially. I know this is not going to happen because there's politics involved and all this other stuff. I'm sure there are, I would think, as far, this is what one of the things I said this is why I said one of the things on Huddle Breakdown when we signed Ida and Engels. I said at the time when I did my analysis, I didn't like either of them. But I liked the fact that we were spending the money, meaning that we were ratcheting up that price band that we were willing to spend on. But I said this all came with the big risk that if these flame out, now is the board, Desmond, I'll live by my own criteria here. Is Desmond going to say, okay, well, let's go buy, a 20-year-old number 10 who plays in Denmark, or who plays in Sweden, or, has a neck tattoo? Use your criteria. I don't know what criteria he's using, but, are we going to ratchet up the spending, but do it more smartly? I think there's a risk to that. But in a perfect world, you cut your losses, you get what you can for them. It's better than letting this contract run out, like in Cham or some of the other ones that we've done. Yeah, or Ajeti or Barkas, or when you realize you've made a mistake, you just make the move. And because we have the balance sheet to, like, there's an accounting issue with this, that when you amortize the cost of the transfer fee, if you do it quick, you're going to take kind of a loss in the book in the financial statements. But like, who gives a crap? We got so much money, and we're so like, now's not the time that you can't absorb something like that. So now, do I think any of that's going to happen? No, because I mean, we're not going to have given our infrastructure and the way our football department is, operations and recruitment. I mean, I worry that if we have more than 2 really good players, that we have important players that we have to replace, that, that's a lot to
It'd be
ask.
too much. Yeah.
Well, when's the last time we had a window where we signed like 3 or 4 guys where you're like, wow, other than the Japanese window? I mean, that was it. So, where's that coming from?
Yeah, I don't see. Yeah, I think you're right. I think if there's too many outgoings, it would be hard to imagine that going around. I think with Ida so with Engels, like I was really confused when we started going for Engels, just because I'd never heard of him, and I've watched a fair amount of Bundesliga. Augsburg are not a team I pay particular attention to, but it was just I'd quite frankly never heard of him. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, Augsburg. But yeah, so it was a bit of a surprise to me. And one of the main criticisms I've had of him this season is just is being a non-event, a non-contributor. It's not necessarily like, he's been terrible or made big gaffes or gave games away, gave goals away or whatever. But the matches where he's maybe come in for criticism, he's just kind of been absent, almost anonymous, I would say. I wouldn't go as far as to say he's been a mistake, or he's maybe a stop-loss situation where you should cut your ties and move on from it, because I do think that he's got the raw material there, personally. But I do think like we're in that halfway house of the midfield, because Bernardo is kind of like a watered down Engels in some regards. Bernardo's not quite at that passing range.
I think they're very similar.
Yeah,
that was part of my criticism of when we signed Engels. Like, we just signed another dude who's not that much different.
Yeah, but for me, Bernardo at least has got a wee bit more of a defensive nose about him, where he can, maybe just put that tackle in, just sniff a bit of danger, read the play a bit more. And I think that's, like, for the midfield, like, I think that's the main thing that's missing. And I think, like I say with Engels and what I mentioned earlier with the Newcastle thing, I had Bernardo into that, another Rodgers signing. I only think the next midfielder we're going to sign is going to be of that kind of shape, of that kind of mold. And it should paint into the whole, like, you guys say it very often. Obviously, you've wrote an article about it, which people can go and check out, of course, which is probably on Patreon or Substack. Substack.
Yeah, Substack.
Yeah. For you guys. And definitely there's a need for that. But I think I see it on this channel quite a lot. Like, Callum McGregor's just like the center of gravity in this team, and that's just never going to change. So I think like maybe one of the solutions could be if we are going to have Engels in that role. We've seen him in the derby, first half with McKeown, second half with Hatate. Then I think you get someone else in that's like a Rodgers signing, another like one of these guys that athletically hit the check marks that these guys clearly did to be identified and brought in the first place. And you maybe, I would never put them in the same breath, but you kind of set me up for it earlier. Give McGregor the Modric role. Just let him be free. Just like, you can take the ball from the defense if you want, but you don't need to. You can go over there. You can do this. You can do that. Read the opposition. Where do you want to go and hide? We'll go and find you. These guys could pass. Don't worry about that. We'll go and get it. And because McGregor is like, his number one thing in that position is game IQ, game management, and like directing the orchestra, as it were. It's not having that sniff of danger. It can be okay tackling. And what you said with Brown, again, like, I think him and Scott Brown are actually two sides of the one coin. And if you had them together, like, problem solved, like for both their careers. Like, if Brown could pass like McGregor, or if McGregor could tackle like Brown, you've probably never had a complaint for either one of them over their career. But there is that deficiency where we don't have that Wanyama that's got a sniff of a danger. Even Beaton was not bad at taking one for the team and standing in the right place, take a yellow card or do that sort of thing. But one of the main, it's very interesting what you said as well about the 4-4-2, and you'd play Engels on the right, because when Engels first came in, we were still in the halfway house of leaving Ange Ball for Brodge 2.0. And in which case, in set-up play, Hatate would look like a left mid, and Engels would look like a right mid. And then you've got other players filling in the middle, of course. And, Engels looked kind of comfortable out there as well. And I mentioned earlier, I think he's done his best work on the left, in fact. But when you said that, that was the first image that popped into my mind, was his first couple of games on the right touchline playing with Kuhn and AJ. So maybe way further down, who knows? But yeah, there's maybe got a wee bit more versatility into him, perhaps, than maybe I'd have thought, or maybe there's another solution kind of in there somehow. Formerly played right back as well, by the way, at Augsburg, for what it's worth.
That's what, in fairness to him, and that Alan made this observation. I mean, because when Alan did his deep dive on him, I mean, he's never really had a settled role, even going back to his time at Bruges too. Like he's and I, you know, the cynic in me would argue that that's probably because he doesn't have like an outstanding characteristic or quality. So people have kind of like, he's a good player, but he doesn't pop in a way that's like, oh, well, this is what he should be doing. So you kind of try to squeeze him in different ways, seeking a role for him. So that's, so he's been moved around a lot, not only at Celtic. And when I say moved around, like his specific role at Celtic has kind of not been stable. He's been moved around a little bit in what he's been asked to do. And that's after him, you know, not really playing at a possession dominant attacking club prior in his career. Like I thought, you know, again, just being a simpleton, I was like, oh, we played at Bruges. That must be how Bruges runs their, you know, second division team. And I went and I looked at the season that he played it. In fairness, it was like 3 seasons ago, whatever. And I think Bruges has been evolving as some of the other clubs have been in Belgium, and their kind of junior team, or whatever you call it, their Division 2 teams. It was like a long ball. Like they finished last in the second tier, and they got shelled. Like they got their asses kicked, and they were playing mostly teenagers. Like it was, you know, it looked to me like it was a bunch of like 17, 18, 19-year-olds who were overwhelmed playing against men. So, you know, they were just hammered. So they were getting, you know, they were bunkering and launching basically. So he went from there then to playing Augsburg in the Bundesliga, which, you know, to your point,
a horrible shift.
They're surviving. Yeah, their job is to stay up and survive, and they did a really good job of it the last couple of seasons. But it's not because he's playing intricate buildup and overloads and combinations out wide with the winger and the fullback and like all the stuff that he's asked to do at Celtic. It's like, so in fairness to Engels, like he's had a steep learning curve. And I don't know, like how do you scout a guy who's not doing any of that stuff or very little of it to say, oh, he's good at that? Well, where the hell are you getting that from? Like, where's the evidence?
Yeah.
and that's
does feel like someone had something on Engels where I'd never heard of him. Like I say, I was just, it's not even as if, like, again, given his age, sometimes young players, like, again, depending on how active you are on the internet, but like people list up and coming wonder kids in a variety of positions,
like Naipan,
nationalities, and
everyone's heard of Naipan now.
Yeah, Naipan, you're talking my language now. But Engels was I honestly never heard of him before we were interested in him. And so yeah, it's like you say, he's not got that defining, he's not got an obvious characteristic, which is, it's just weird how we came upon him in a way, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah. Well, and that's, so you hear rumors, you hear, you know, the ITK people, which I am definitively not. But you know, from what I've heard generally, I've heard it from enough different places that we're still kind of agent driven, and we're not doing a lot of proactive kind of screening, filtering, profiling, building a database of guys we would want, and then laying the groundwork to pipeline guys 1 or 2 windows ahead as their development curve matures. You know, maybe they prove themselves here or there or whatever. I think it's still very kind of guys who know guys and agents. That seems, and then with a billionaire major shareholder who sticks his nose in, kind of half cocked. You know, it's I joke he's kind of like again, people that know American football, he's like the guy who runs and owns the Dallas Cowboys, like Jerry Jones. Like Jerry Jones has been like that since he won a couple of Super Bowls early. I guess 3 Super Bowls early in his ownership. Based off of like crazy drafts and a trade for Herschel Walker that set him up with all these picks. And he had a really good coach who basically was controlling everything. And then he fired that coach and started managing everything. And the team's gone to hell ever since. We're talking 25 years now. He's the de facto GM. His son runs things, and he doesn't care. Like he's basically playing football manager as the billionaire owner. So
Yeah.
there's plenty of examples of big time sports where wealthy ownership screws things up because they stick their nose in where they're not particularly skilled. Because billionaires tend to have big egos, from what I've been told.
Goes with territory, you
So
think?
yeah, one would presume, but yeah. So that I suspect Engels was some form of agent recommendation, or somebody knew somebody, or
Somebody's got a hunch.
I can't come up with a process like anyone who developed a data driven process that would lead to him.
Yeah.
They must be on acid. I don't know. I don't know where that would have come from.
And I'm very much thinking of yourself, like, we should be pipelining these guys, keeping tabs on them. Like, we don't sign anyone and they go, "Oh, Celtic have been trying to get me for years," like other players do for other clubs around the world. This is something people say. We never get that. And it felt like maybe Kvitsgarden would have been one of those ones, because I know you're saying maybe sign him last year, but see, to be honest with you, James, like when I first seen us getting linked to him, I didn't get too excited. Like, he had a purple patch, and I thought, "Oh, he maybe scored like 8 goals in 5 games or something." And
Yeah.
I thought, this is why we're being linked to him, because he's caught fire. But he had periods in and out the team. If you look at him now, you can clearly see he is starting to flourish a bit, and Bromby are getting a real tune out of him. And maybe that'll be one of the first ones where it's like, oh, we've worked on this transfer for a while and
Yeah.
we've eventually made it work. But it feels like maybe he's going to go somewhere else now.
We're priced out of him by now, I think.
Yeah.
I think so the Transfer Flow newsletter, which is something that Ted Knutson, who started StatsBomb and then sold it recently. StatsBomb is one of the highest end data providers that clubs use. And so they have a newsletter, and his newsletter profiled undercovered strikers in Europe, and Kvistgarden was one of them. Because now you're right, like his data is now popping, and this is where the artistry of analytics comes in. So when I looked at him at first, it was 2 summers ago. I think we were first rumored with him when he was like 20 years old. His raw production wasn't there yet, but a lot of the stuff that I use that kind of assesses IQ, like I've talked about with O'Reilly, and another aspect of what I do, this goes back to like a systems analytics thing, is looking at, so you can have people like Frimpong was just dynamic and quick and fast, right? So when you have outlier guys, when you have Ronaldo Nehemiah, or like a world-class athlete sprinter type, like they don't even have to be that good at much else than that, and they can be an awesome player. But generally speaking, particularly when you're talking about skilled positions like midfield or creative positions, you want to have a robust profile so that they have multiple aspects of what they're good at. Because then what happens is when if you're really good, or you're one of the best players at a good team, what inevitably happens is teams game plan to try and take away what you're good at then. So when you have a robust profile, that gets harder. And like if you're in the NBA, if you're just a scorer and your passing sucks, well, then they're going to double team you, and then you're never going to be able to score, and you're going to turn the ball over a bunch because you can't pass, right? So a robust player is one that is multifaceted and good and across the way. And so there's been, since I started doing this benchmarking data analysis that I do for recruitment, the players that we sign are like the really highly rumored ones. It's been Matt O'Reilly, Kyogo, Lennon Miller, and Kvistgarden. So that's, those are guys who showed quality in underlying metrics and in a robust way. So that's why I was kind of on Kvistgarden early. And that's where, if you have robustness, guys that are young, like 18, 19, 20, then I think those are the ones that your floor is quite high. I mean, that the risk of signing somebody like that, I think, is pretty low, because they're going to be a good player. The question is, what's the ceiling? Are they going to explode? I don't think O'Reilly has exploded to be someone who's going to go for 80 million to like a top 4 EPL team, right? So that would be like that's a Frimpong, because of his athleticism, he might go there. So if you have this robustness in the profile, then you have a higher floor, and then it's about ceiling. And I think that's, we're not getting enough of either of those with how we do our signings. Yeah, I see that with Tilio.
Yeah.
Not good.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Sorry, that comment just totally derailed me there for a second.
Yeah,
because Tilio, the one player we have tracked, and he's back in Australia. He'll be back in the summer.
And you know what? That's the other thing. So these development curves are not consistent. You have averages and stuff. So some guys are late bloomers.
Yeah.
So we've all been young men. Some of us are younger than others. So we know just by the study of the brain. I mean, men generally don't stop having their brains developing until age 25-ish. So maturity, all these other things, like depending on their upbringing and family environment and all that stuff, some guys aren't able to be a 24/7 athlete, dedicated professional at age 22. Some of them, like Holm, it sounds like that might have been what happened when we signed Holm. Like I was very positive on the Holm signing based off of what is kind of my heuristic on how I analyze players, not to the degree of like an O'Reilly, but quite good. But he just seems, there wasn't a fit there for whatever reason. It seemed to be a personality issue or maybe a behavioral issue. But we'll see. Like, he's going to LAFC now, and I'm excited to see how he does. And whether he
the weekend.
Yeah, I saw that. He's been coming off a calf. So I'm optimistic on him if he can mature, but he's young enough that maybe he'll outgrow some of the behavioral stuff that we all, if you're a dumbass 22-year-old guy, we all made stupid lifestyle decisions at different times, or most of us anyway. So
totally. And I think that's something like Hatate gets this kind of thing leveled at him for, like, oh, he's not got that much senior experience for a guy of his age, because it feels like the Japanese system recognizes that. And it's like, these guys are not in our mad rush if you look after them properly, and they can have their career. Like, they can, like, if you look at the J League, anyone that's bored, like, there is an obscene amount of players that are over 30 years old, pushing on to the 40 mark quite comfortably. So like that mental age, that, like, it's great when players like Naipan break out when they're 16, 17 and get lots of, time in the trenches and really earn their battles, earn their stripes and their battle scars and all the rest of it. But there's more than kind of one side to that. The one thing that was kind of falling at the back of my head that I wanted to make sure I said to you is, if you are a fan of Naipan, and if you do catch any Rosenborg, I don't know if you're that crazy, James, but they have a player.
Only clips on Y Scout.
Okay. Well, next time you're on Y Scout and you get something to kill, there's another Rosenborg player I would quite fancy us having a look at, and maybe the experts can decide whether we should. And his name is Marius Broholm. So not quite Odenholm, but Broholm. And I don't want to say, what it's like when you compare a player against like a legend. It's not to say he's as good as this guy, but like a little nippy David Silva, kind of like an attacking mid guy, but he'll hack you if he needs to. You can maybe stick him out wide if you know he's not a winger. He's a fun player. I like him.
I would take a discount version of that. I mean, that's not so bad. Yeah, so he just turned 20. Yeah. Okay, I'll take a look at him. Yeah, so that's, you guys that do it so rare. You're all over the place. You have all these awesome insights into different leagues, and I don't have the bandwidth for that much. So I limit it to ones that are seriously rumored with Celtic. So
yeah, that's a good way to go as well. James, I think I've taken up enough of your time. So I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a great episode. I've had tons of fun. I could probably run for another little while yet. And I think the next time, I think we're already kind of lining up for me to come back to your place for another time as well. And unless there was anything that we've touched on that you wanted to touch on, that we maybe jump past or whatever, but I've kind of ran out of things to bring up.
I'm sure the poor people that have stuck with us this long are tired of hearing me. So thanks for having me again, and we'll reconnect in the near future over at Huddle Breakdown.
You're very humble, James. I doubt that very much. I'm sure everyone that's tuned in said a great time listening to you joining us today. So thanks very much. It is appreciated. All of James's channels, Twitter and YouTube and everything, are linked down below in the description in case you missed that earlier. Be sure to check out Huddle Breakdown on YouTube, and has social media everywhere. James's own personal Twitter or X is linked down there as well, of course. And yeah, thanks everyone that's joined in. It's been a pleasure, and we'll catch you on the next one. Hail, hail, James.
Hail, hail.